In a valley where the road ends, a family's bloodline folded in on itself until their very faces began to repeat generation after generation, a mirror with no escape. The valley lies hidden, cupped between ridges that rise like great shoulders of stone, their slopes heavy with pine and oak. The roads that approach it begin as ordinary county tracks, rutted by wagons and softened by mud, but as they press inward, they narrow until they are little more than cart paths. Travelers who venture that far speak of a strange stillness that overtakes them, as though the air itself has grown thicker, heavy with the resin of the trees. Horses balk, pulling against reins, as if reluctant to enter. The valley does not welcome the living, it swallows them. No map bears its name. County surveyors passed it by, choosing instead to chart the farmland where rivers ran straight and towns had reason to grow. What lay within the ridges was of little use to commerce or church. It was a place where the sun arrived late and departed early, where winter's frost lingered weeks longer than in neighboring fields. The soil could yield corn and potatoes, but not enough to tempt those who might have settled there with ambition. Those who remained did so not from prosperity, but from something darker, necessity or secrecy, or perhaps both. Silence defines the hollow, not the ordinary quiet of country lanes where one hears birdsong and the wind in trees, but a deeper hush, an absence of sound that unsettles the body. Neighbors in the lowlands swore that no crickets sang there after dusk. Travelers recorded how even the calls of owls seemed to falter as they crossed into its shadow. At night, the ridges penned in the darkness, so that the stars overhead looked faint, blurred by the rising mist. To stand in the hollow after sunset was to feel the world contract, the horizon pressed close until one sensed no escape. Isolation shapes people as surely as it shapes land. Families who built cabins there in the late 1700s did not leave. Their surnames, etched into fading headstones in the small family plots, repeat with an unnerving rhythm. Generations upon generations, the same names carried forward until they ceased to sound like given names at all and became echoes of themselves. Outsiders who stumbled into the valley remarked not only on the resemblance of faces, but on the sameness of manner. The way the men kept their eyes low, the way the women spoke in half-whispers, the way the children scattered at the sight of a stranger. The hollow earned its reputation not from violence, nor from plague, but from an atmosphere that resisted intrusion. It was the place where the road ended and the silence began, where the ridges themselves seemed to guard what lay within. To enter it was to step out of the ordinary world and into something older, heavier, and profoundly unsettling. It was a land cut off, not only by geography, but by choice. Those who lived there had chosen distance, and in that distance, something else had begun to grow. They came into the valley long before the county had proper lines, back when the ridges were still spoken of as wilderness rather than home. Scots-Irish settlers, hard-faced and spare, carrying with them little more than muskets, seed corn, and the hard faith that had driven them across the Atlantic. They cut trees, raised cabins from notched logs, and cleared patches of field where the soil turned black beneath the blade of the plow. Their blood ran thick with old grievances, feuds carried from Ulster, mistrust of authority, suspicion of anyone who was not kin. From the beginning, they built their lives behind closed doors, preferring the company of their own to the gaze of strangers. The surname they carried into the hollow was one that still lingers on a scattering of county records, written in ink now browned and fragile. Clerks who copied deeds and baptisms left it unadorned, but the notes in the margins betray unease. A curious people, one minister wrote beside the entry of a marriage. Another, recording a baptism in the 1790 seconds, remarked, "I question the parentage, but dare not press them." It was not illegality that troubled officials so much as the sense that the family obeyed laws older than the counties, rules that existed inside their bloodline alone. Neighbors at first welcomed them as pioneers. The family could be relied upon to fight wolves, to lend an axe in clearing land, to stand guard when raids threatened. Yet even in those early years a difference showed itself. They traded only what they could not make themselves: salt, iron nails, the occasional musket ball. Rarely did they attend church, and when they did, their silence unsettled the congregation. While others sang hymns in ragged harmony, they stood mute, eyes fixed on the floorboards. Children sat unsmiling, their faces pale beneath dark hair that seemed to carry the same sheen from one to the next. As decades passed, their insularity hardened into something more deliberate. Sons and daughters married within the family, first cousins binding themselves by vows spoken on porches or in candlelit cabins rather than in front of ministers. The county kept the records because law required it, but whispers grew. Old women in market towns remarked that the children all favored one another too strongly. Midwives told of infants born with peculiarities, weak of breath or slow to take milk, though few dared speak it aloud. By the early 1800s, the family had become less a branch on the county tree than a closed circle unto itself. Outsiders who married in quickly disappeared from public notice, absorbed into the silence of the hollow. Their surname, once just another among many, grew heavier with each generation until it carried with it not respect, not even notoriety, but caution. To speak it aloud in taverns was to invite uneasy glances, as though the very name bore weight enough to silence the room. It was a family set apart, not by distance alone, but by choice and by blood that was beginning to turn back upon itself. By the first decades of the 19th century, the family's path narrowed until it seemed to lead nowhere at all. Where once there had been the occasional union with neighboring farms, a cousin marrying into a family over the ridge, or a daughter sent to a distant township with a dowry of corn and a milk cow, those ties began to unravel. Outsiders whispered that suitors turned away not because of want, but because of something older and harder, to name a suspicion that the family's silence carried with it a cost. Within the hollow, the change was quieter, almost invisible. Marriages that had once opened gates to new names and new blood now drew the circle tighter. Cousins wed cousins, nephews took nieces as wives, and the banns of marriage, when recorded at all, were marked in church books with an unease that nearly bled through the ink. Ministers performed the rites because the law demanded it, but their journals reveal hesitation. One wrote in a margin that the bride looked scarcely more than a child, and the groom bore the same surname, though from a different cabin on the same ridge. Another crossed out the word kinsman in his notes, only to replace it with husband. These small acts of discomfort did little to stop the pattern. Each generation found itself with fewer choices, until the only choice left was each other. The family had become its own world, a community folded inward like a shuttered house where no fresh air enters. The outside world noticed the shift less in official registers than in rumor. A neighbor arriving with goods to trade would remark on how often he saw the same faces, how the children from one household resembled those from another with unnerving precision. A traveler who attended a wedding feast spoke of the guests addressing one another as cousin, so frequently he could no longer keep their relations straight. When he asked who the bride's mother was, he was met with silence and averted eyes, as though his question had broken some unspoken rule. Over time, the family stopped seeking the church's blessing altogether. Some unions passed without banns, sealed instead in the dim light of cabins where only kin bore witness. The county's official records grew thinner, but inside the hollow, the family's ties thickened. What was once necessity hardened into tradition. The closed gate was no longer temporary but permanent, its latch fastened by generations who could not or would not look beyond their own blood. What emerged was not merely isolation, but a lineage bent back upon itself. The valley had become a closed loop, a place where names repeated endlessly, faces echoed from parent to child with uncanny sameness, and the future narrowed into a corridor lined with mirrors. Outsiders spoke of it in hushed tones, as though the air itself would carry their words into the ridges and return them altered. The family did not hear those whispers, or if they did not care. The gate had closed, and within its enclosure they would remain. The children who filled the cabins of the hollow seemed, at first glance, like any others barefoot, with mud on their shins and hair uncombed from days spent running the ridges. Yet to those who looked closer, something was amiss. Their features carried a sameness that was difficult to dismiss, a repetition that unsettled the eye. One boy might be mistaken for his cousin across the creek, a girl for her aunt in the next cabin. Neighbors who came to trade for corn or wool remarked that it felt less like meeting different children than like encountering copies of the same few faces, drawn again and again in slightly altered lines. County visitors began to notice the pattern as early as the 1820 seconds. A traveling schoolmaster, hired to teach letters to the children of the ridge, recorded his observations in a ledger that still survives in faded ink. "The faces repeat themselves," he wrote. "I feel as though I look upon the same child 10 times over. Their eyes are close set, their lips thin, their manner hesitant. When one struggles to spell, so do they all, as if they share a single mind that falters in the same places." His lessons did not last long. After a winter of frustration, he abandoned the post, leaving behind only his notes and the whisper that the children of the hollow were not quite right. The repetition of features grew more pronounced with each generation. Visitors spoke of heads slightly misshapen, of jawlines that seemed unfinished, of eyes that did not quite focus in the same direction. Yet it was not only appearance that carried this echo. Their speech, when they spoke at all, bore the same peculiar rhythm, as though sentences had been taught by imitation rather than invention. Laughter sounded alike, a stuttering giggle that unnerved outsiders who heard it ripple from one cabin to the next. Among themselves, none of this seemed strange. In the hollow, a child was cherished not for difference but for belonging. Mothers rocked infants who already bore the unmistakable family look, and fathers declared them strong, seeing in their faces confirmation that the bloodline endured. It was the neighbors beyond the ridges who whispered otherwise. Farmers from the lowlands spoke in taverns about those children who all look like brothers. Some swore the family could be recognized at a glance, even from a distance, by the way their heads tilted downward when addressed, as though one gesture had been passed through generations as faithfully as eye color or hair. The repetition was more than resemblance. It was inheritance turned inward, a pattern etched too deeply to be broken. In a county where diversity of blood was the measure of strength, the hollow produced children who seemed to circle back upon themselves. Each new birth was less a step forward than a return, as if the past had begun to carve its likeness into the future. By the middle of the century, the phrase carried on the lips of outsiders held a weight of both pity and fear. The faces repeat themselves. The schoolhouse that stood at the edge of the valley was a single-room structure of rough-hewn logs, its roof patched with tin and moss, its windows clouded with smoke from years of wood stove fires. Children from the hollow were sent there in fits and starts, urged by county officials who insisted that every family contribute to the census of learning. Yet, their presence in the schoolroom was never steady. They arrived late, often without shoes, and sat apart, their posture hunched as though the benches themselves resisted them. Teachers soon discovered that these children were unlike the others who trudged miles along dirt roads with slates under their arms. Attendance logs tell the story more clearly than memory. Beside their names, written in a careful but uncertain hand, are notes that repeat with unnerving regularity. Cannot read letters, stammers, forgets lessons quickly, wanders. Whole rows of entries are marked by such remarks, as though the same assessment had been carried from child to child. Teachers grew exasperated. Lessons that other pupils grasped in weeks seemed to dissolve from the minds of the hollow children as soon as they left the schoolhouse door. The alphabet was a puzzle never solved, numbers blurred into one another. One boy, after months of instruction, could only recite his own name, and even then only in a halting voice that broke halfway through. The superintendent of schools, visiting in the 1840 seconds, left a brief but telling report. He wrote of peculiar deficiencies in the pupils of the Hollow, noting their sluggish attention and odd manner of speech. His remarks, tucked into county ledgers, read less like an educational record and more like a diagnosis. The words were chosen carefully, for officials were reluctant to accuse openly, yet the implication was plain. These were children set apart, bearing burdens not of their own making. Whispers spread beyond the schoolhouse walls. Parents of other students muttered that their children should not sit beside the Hollow kin, fearing that strangeness might rub off like soot. In the playground, games faltered when the Hollow children joined. They did not follow rules easily, their attention straying, their laughter too loud or arriving at the wrong moment. Some sat in silence, staring into the distance while others played. Others burst suddenly into shouts that ended as quickly as they began. Teachers tried patience, then discipline, but neither produced change. By the close of each term, it was common for the Hollow families to withdraw their children altogether, citing the distance of the walk or the need for help in the fields. In truth, the schoolhouse had little place for them, and they little place within it. Their names remained in the ledgers, their deficiencies noted, but their presence faded back into the valley. The Hollow did not teach its children in letters or sums. It passed down only its own repetitions, its silence, and the strange inheritance that outsiders recognized but could not name. The schoolhouse whispered what the family already knew. Knowledge from beyond their blood did not take root here. The year 1839 left its mark on the Hollow in a way no harvest or storm ever had. By then, the family had already sealed itself inward. Cousins joined to cousins, children repeating the faces of their elders, the rhythms of their speech breaking against silence. Yet what had been whispered as peculiarity soon showed itself in darker form. The man at the center was a patriarch, one of the eldest still living, a figure who had long ruled his household with the authority of years. His voice had once carried steadiness, his hand guiding plows and disciplining sons with the certainty of a man who believed his order would last. But that year, something in him began to falter. Neighbors told of changes gradual at first, a muttering to himself in fields, long pauses at the fence line where he stood staring toward nothing, the sudden start of laughter at odd hours. By summer, the muttering had grown into shouting, phrases torn apart by rage, words no one could understand. His children hid from him in the barn. His wife was seen once standing at the edge of the road with bruises hidden beneath her shawl. Travelers passing through heard screams tearing across the valley at night, not the sound of quarrel but of something more primal, broken cries echoing until dogs howled in response. The county physician was called, a man accustomed to fevers and broken bones, not the unraveling of the mind. His notes, still preserved in an early ledger, speak with unusual bluntness. Hereditary affliction, he wrote, the phrase underlined as if to fix the blame in blood rather than circumstance. He observed the patriarch's eyes, wild, shifting, incapable of focus, and his hands, in constant tremor, striking out without provocation. The physician recommended confinement, not treatment, for there was no cure he could offer. The family did as he advised, boarding the windows of a back room, fastening the door with iron hinges. From that room, the valley carried stories. Neighbors working fields nearby swore they could hear the man raging through the night, his voice rising into shrieks that seemed not wholly human. Others described long silences broken suddenly by pounding on the walls, as though he hurled himself against them in furious desperation. For months, these sounds continued until at last they grew faint, then ceased altogether. No burial was recorded, no stone set in the ground. It was assumed he died where he had been sealed away, the room becoming both his prison and his grave. The incident planted unease beyond the family. Whispers grew in taverns and markets that what plagued him was not madness alone, but the visible fruit of generations marrying within their own blood. The physician's phrase, hereditary affliction, echoed longer than the man's screams. It suggested that what began in him would not end with him, that his outbursts were not accident but omen. From that year forward, the hollow was no longer spoken of only as isolated. It was marked as cursed, a place where the mind itself seemed to turn against those bound by the same name. The hollow's soil was dark and heavy, rich enough to give back more than it was asked for. Corn grew tall and straight in the summer heat, potatoes fattened beneath the earth, and orchards heavy with apples lined the ridges. To those who passed through, the family's farm appeared almost enviable. The rows of crops carefully tended, fences mended, tools sharpened and set in place. Livestock grazed in orderly pastures, their coats clean, their bodies healthy. On the outside, nothing betrayed decline. The land itself seemed unwilling to share in the disorder of the bloodline. It thrived as though mocking the withering of the people who worked it. But to step across the threshold of the farmhouse was to encounter a different reality. Travelers who were invited inside, or who forced entry by duty of trade or law, left accounts that contradicted the image of prosperity. The rooms were dim and close, heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies and rotting food. Dishes piled in corners, beds left unmade for weeks, hearthstones streaked with grease and ash. Silence reigned in long stretches, broken only by sudden bursts of noise, an eruption of laughter that rang sharp and without reason, or muttered arguments between family members that trailed into incoherence. One peddler, who later wrote of his journey in a county paper, described the experience of dining with the family. The table was set with fresh bread and salted pork, yet the family sat in silence for long minutes before eating, staring down at their plates as if uncertain of the task. When they finally began, their movements were jerky, their conversation broken by stammers and half-formed words. At intervals, one of them would laugh suddenly, a sound so out of place it chilled the visitor more than anger would have. He noted that the food itself was good, even plentiful, but the atmosphere was so thick with unease that he could scarcely swallow. Children darted through the halls without shoes, their faces smeared with dirt, their eyes watchful. They moved not with the careless play of ordinary youth but with the nervous energy of creatures accustomed to disruption. A sudden crash from an upper room might send them scattering, though no explanation was ever offered. The patriarchs of the farm, once figures of stern order, now appeared withdrawn or volatile, their presence felt in glances rather than words. The contrast between the fields and the house struck every visitor. Outside, the land bore witness to discipline, rhythm, and survival. Inside, decay spread unchecked. It was as if the family could marshal its strength only against the earth, never against itself. Neighbors began to remark that the crops looked finer each year, while the family seemed to sink further into silence and strangeness. The farm thrived, producing bounty enough to fill markets. Yet within the house, disorder was king, and the laughter that echoed in the night sounded less like joy than like madness refusing to be contained. The road into the hollow was never meant for travelers. It wound between ridges, narrowed by brambles and fallen branches, and ended in a thicket where no wagon could pass. Yet now and then, strangers strayed there. A hunter chasing game, a tinker searching for a shortcut, a peddler lured by rumor of a farm that yielded more than most. Those who came back left behind stories that carried a weight of warning, stories repeated in taverns until the hollow's name became a thing muttered rather than spoken aloud. The accounts were strangely consistent. Strangers would find themselves before a farmhouse ringed with orderly fields, the rows of corn and beans tended with a precision that spoke of labor. Yet when they approached the door, the air shifted. The family who answered appeared less like hosts than shadows of hosts. Their stares were vacant, eyes unfocused, as though sight itself had turned inward. Movements came in jolts, a sudden jerk of the head, a hand twitching against the frame. Words, when spoken, were halved and broken, muttered in tones too low to catch or strung together in ways that carried no sense. Visitors would nod politely, waiting for meaning to emerge, only to find silence had fallen again. One traveler, a merchant from the lowlands, described being invited to sit on the porch. A girl, perhaps 14, brought him water in a tin cup. When he thanked her, she did not respond, but stood staring until an older man muttered something in her ear. She laughed without cause, the sound rising high and sharp before cutting off in an instant. The merchant said it was the laughter, more than the silence, that convinced him he had wandered too far. He drained the cup quickly and made his excuses, leaving before dusk. Another account came from a circuit preacher who had hoped to bring scripture to the valley. He found the family assembled in their yard, watching him without expression. When he began to speak of salvation, they did not kneel or nod. They shifted restlessly, their mouths moving as if repeating words only they could hear. When he finished, not a soul spoke. They turned, one by one, and walked back into the house, leaving him alone. He did not return, and in his journal he wrote only, "There is no soil for the word in that place." Those who encountered the family carried away an unease that lingered longer than memory of the path. They never returned twice. Each account reinforced the others until the hollow was avoided altogether. The message spread without proclamation. A stranger might be tolerated once, but the valley itself refused them thereafter. The unwelcomed visitor left unharmed, yet altered, carrying with him the certainty that some doors were not meant to be opened, and some families not meant to be known. The wedding took place on a late autumn afternoon, when the ridges were already bare of leaves and the air carried the first bite of frost. Smoke from the farmhouse chimney drifted into a gray sky, and inside preparations were sparse. A table cleared of clutter, a few chairs brought close, a single candle burning at the center. The bride was scarcely more than a child, her dress hastily sewn from plain muslin, the hem brushing her ankles unevenly. Her hair, unadorned, was braided down her back. She did not smile, nor did she look at the man who waited to claim her as wife. He was her uncle, a man twice her age, his beard streaked with gray, his face drawn into lines that spoke less of age than of years turned inward. The preacher, summoned from a neighboring town, arrived reluctantly. His journal, preserved in fragments, tells of the unease that had settled over him the moment he entered the hollow. He performed the rite as required, reciting words that had sanctified countless unions, but here the phrases seemed to falter, hanging in the stagnant air. The family stood as witnesses, their expressions unreadable, their silence pressing more heavily than any hymn. When the vows were spoken, the girl's voice barely carried, trembling as though each word were a burden she could not quite lift. The uncle's reply was steady, unshaken, as if the ritual were nothing more than the turning of a wheel long set in motion. Neighbors would later speak of the preacher's departure, his face pale, his horse driven hard down the ridge as if fleeing something unholy. In his journal, beneath the blank space where he might have written the names of bride and groom, he left only 4 words. God forgive them. That silence in the record spoke louder than any detail. It was as if he refused to grant them even the dignity of inscription, as though to write their names together would bind him too closely to the act. The marriage itself did not mark a beginning so much as a continuation of what had already become inevitable in the hollow. Cousins joined to cousins, kin bound to kin. But this union, a child to her uncle, pushed the practice into something darker, something even the most insular of families could scarcely disguise. Outsiders heard whispers and recoiled. Some claimed the girl carried a hollow look in her eyes afterward, as though the childhood had been drained from her all at once. Others said she bore children of her own within a few years, infants whose faces bore the same repeating features, the same echo of blood that folded in upon itself. The wedding left behind no celebration, no feast, no songs of joy. It left only silence, broken by the scrape of chairs against the floor and the low mutter of kin dispersing back into the rooms of the farmhouse. What endured was the absence in the preacher's book, the blank line where names should have stood. That empty space became its own testimony, a quiet refusal to give permanence to what should never have been. The church ledger of the county parish was meant to stand as a record of order. births and baptisms inscribed in neat columns, marriages marked with care, deaths recorded with solemn finality. Yet when the minister's hand reached the names from the hollow, the ink often faltered. The entries that should have spoken with clarity instead bore hesitation, crossings out, and the smudge of second thoughts. Infants were brought to the font by mothers who offered no clear account of their fathers, or by fathers who stumbled when asked to name the mother. On some lines, both names were given, then struck through, replaced with guesses or left blank altogether. It was as though even the act of recording could not impose certainty upon the tangled bloodlines of the valley. By the 1820 the word illegitimate appeared so often beside the hollow family that it lost the power to shame. Other parishioners whispered when they saw it repeated again and again, but the family themselves showed no sign of concern. They stood at the font with bowed heads, not in humility but in silence, accepting the water on the child's brow as if the act were a formality demanded by outsiders, nothing more. The infants squirmed in their mother's arms, faces already bearing that sameness which made them indistinguishable from the cousins who had been carried forward in the months before. The minister, in his private journal, confessed to doubts about the worth of his pen. "I cannot make sense of their unions," he wrote after one baptism in 1833. "Cousins stand as husband and wife, yet I am told the child belongs to the uncle. The lines blur until I know not whom I baptize. In the ledger itself, the struggle is plain. Names crossed out with sharp lines, rewritten more faintly above or beside, as if he hoped no one would notice. On one page, an infant's parentage is changed 3 times in the span of a single entry, the final version ending with a blank space where the father's name should have stood. As years passed, the minister began leaving the designations off altogether. To mark each child as illegitimate was to fill the book with condemnation, a task that wearied even the most dutiful scribe. So the columns filled instead with half-truths, initials in place of names, vague notations of parents unknown, despite the fact that the parents stood before him in the pews. The omissions spoke more loudly than words. For the rest of the county, the church record served as proof of lineage, as ties that bound families into the larger fabric of community. For the hollow, they became something else entirely, a shadowed chronicle of uncertainty, a ledger where truth was softened, erased, or rewritten until it no longer resembled truth at all. In those pages, one could glimpse the unraveling of order, not in open defiance, but in the quiet collapse of names into silence. In the summer of 1862, the war spilled into valleys that had long been left to their own silence. Union troops marched along ridges and streams, setting up encampments where pastures offered space and fresh water. One surgeon attached to a regiment found himself stationed near the hollow. His duty was to care for the wounded, but his notes reveal another encounter altogether, one that had nothing to do with battle and everything to do with the family hidden within those ridges. Curiosity first drew him there. He had heard from local guides of an isolated clan whose presence was known but seldom spoken of in detail. Expecting little more than a poor farmstead, he followed the narrow path until he came upon fields shockingly well tended, rows of corn unbroken and fences kept tight against livestock. It was when he reached the farmhouse that his impressions shifted. The door creaked open, and figures emerged, not hurriedly, not with the wary caution of people unaccustomed to strangers, but slowly, as though summoned from a deep and private world. The surgeon's description is clinical yet haunted. "Faces slack as masks," he wrote in his pocket ledger. "Speech guttural, motions animal. I mistook them first for the feeble-minded wards of a poorhouse." He noted the sameness in their expressions, their eyes dull yet intent, fixed on him as though measuring whether he was of any use or threat. When they spoke, the words came in fragments, half swallowed, one syllable dragged into another until meaning dissolved. A young boy laughed abruptly in the middle of the exchange, a jagged sound that startled even the adults around him, who offered no correction. The surgeon attempted small questions, names, ages, kinship, but was met with muttered replies that shifted each time he asked. He observed their movements, how they rocked slightly as they stood, how their hands twitched as though restless even at rest. He compared them to patients he had once seen in an asylum, but remarked that here there were no keepers, no overseers, only bloodkin who mirrored one another's strangeness. Later, back in camp, he shared his impressions with fellow officers. Some dismissed the story as exaggeration, others laughed it off as a surgeon's fancy born of fatigue. Yet his notes carried a gravity that his words in conversation did not. "They are not mad by chance," he wrote. "It is in their very making, an inheritance of defect passed through generations." He recorded no names, only sketches of faces, crude outlines that looked more like masks than portraits. The war would move on, battles raging elsewhere, but the surgeon's account remained, buried in army records until years later. For the Hollow, it was another shadow cast upon their story. A passing visitor who glimpsed them not as farmers or neighbors, but as something less than human. A family whose blood had turned inward until even a physician mistook them forwards of a poorhouse. The Civil War carved its path through the countryside with fire and cannon, leaving towns in ash and families divided, yet in the Hollow it seemed only a distant storm. Armies passed along the ridges above, their drums rattling through valleys, their banners snapping in the wind. Smoke from skirmishes smudged the sky, and the cries of men carried for miles, but within the Hollow life moved with the same rhythm it always had. Fields were tended, livestock fed, cabins shuttered against strangers. The world beyond might have been ending, yet here it was as though nothing had begun. Neighbors told of stopping by to warn the family when soldiers were sighted nearby. They urged caution, offered advice, even suggested hiding valuables. The family only stared, blank-eyed, as though the words carried no weight. When pressed about Lincoln, whose very name had become a watchword for change, they asked who he was. One farmer swore that a grown man from the Hollow, perhaps in his 30s, shrugged at the mention of the president and muttered that he had never heard of him. The testimony spread quickly, repeated with both scorn and unease. They did not know who Lincoln was. To the rest of the county, this ignorance was not innocence but proof of how far the family had drifted from the common life of the nation. The war did touch them in small ways. Soldiers occasionally strayed into the Hollow, searching for forage or shelter. Those who returned spoke of encounters that left them unsettled. One cavalryman recalled knocking on a cabin door to find a group inside staring silently. Children crouched in corners, the air thick with a smell of neglect. They offered no food, no speech, only the weight of their gaze. He left quickly, preferring hunger to the strangeness he felt pressing in from the walls. Despite such visits, the family seemed untouched by the upheaval that tore the South apart. They did not enlist, did not speak of loyalty to Union or Confederacy. Their fields continued to yield crops, and their isolation shielded them from the hunger that swept other households. Yet that very isolation deepened. Roads into the Hollow grew more overgrown as traffic dwindled, and the few who ventured there came back whispering that the family lived as though the world outside had ceased to exist. When peace returned and soldiers laid down arms, the county rebuilt with weary determination. The Hollow, however, offered no sign that anything had changed. Children grew into adults who bore the same faces, spoke in the same broken cadences, and carried the same silence that had always marked them. The war had churned through the land like a tempest, but in this valley, silence remained, as though time itself had refused to move forward. By the last decades of the 19th century, county scholars began to take interest in the lineages of old families, tracing migrations from Europe, marriages across valleys, and the gradual weaving of bloodlines that gave the region its shape. But when their pens turned toward the Hollow, they found themselves faced with something they had not seen before. Where most trees branched outward, sprouting new names and widening circles of kin, this one bent back upon itself. Branches folded inward, Cousins bound to cousins, uncles wedded to nieces, the same names repeating until the record ceased to look like a tree at all, and instead resembled a knot. One genealogist, after weeks of study, set down a single note in the margin of his work. They have become their own forebears. It was not a metaphor, but a plain description. Children bore the same first names as fathers, faces mirrored those of grandparents without variation, and marriages tightened the circle until past and future seemed indistinguishable. To trace their bloodline was not to follow a story of expansion, but of collapse, a narrowing spiral that left no way out. This strange inheritance revealed itself not only on parchment but in the bodies and minds of the living. Neighbors testified that by the 1,880 seconds, the hollow's inhabitants displayed peculiar afflictions with a frequency too common to dismiss as chance. Children grew with limbs twisted, spines curved, or eyes that failed to focus. Adults spoke in broken cadences, some lapsing into silence altogether, their thoughts locked away. Fits of rage and confusion became part of the rhythm of life, accepted by kin as natural as the seasons. The family did not seek doctors. They bound their afflicted to the home, boarded windows, and let the cries echo into the night until they were spent. To outsiders, it appeared as though madness had become their inheritance as surely as the land itself. Reports in county ledgers noted the strangeness with careful phrasing. Afflicted with nervous disorder, one clerk wrote beside a man's name. Child unsound of mind, read another line in a school register. But privately, in taverns and in the margins of journals, words were plainer. Madness had taken root in the hollow, not through illness or accident, but through blood. For the family, there was no distinction. They did not name the afflictions, nor mark them as deviations. Children born with dull eyes or erratic speech were still gathered to the table, still worked in the fields when able. To them, this was simply what the blood gave. Yet to those who stood beyond the ridges, the sight of the hollow had become a living testament to what happens when inheritance turns inward. The family endured, but each generation carried less of the world and more of itself, until even the scholars charting their lines admitted the truth. They had ceased to belong to the county's future. They belonged only to their own past. The reports reached the courthouse in the spring of 1897, carried first by a farmer who worked land near the hollow. He told of hearing screams at night, not the sharp cries of quarreling kin but long, ragged sounds that seemed torn from a throat raw with use. Other neighbors echoed the account, saying the noises came in bursts, sometimes breaking the stillness for hours before falling silent again. At last, the county sheriff, a man more accustomed to settling disputes over boundary lines and livestock, saddled his horse and made his way toward the hollow. His duty demanded it, though he admitted later he rode with unease, as if the ridges themselves resisted his passage. He found the farm just as others had described, fields immaculate, fences tight, livestock healthy. But the farmhouse windows were shuttered despite the daylight, and no voices greeted him from the porch. When he called out, the door creaked open, and several family members appeared, their faces blank, their eyes low. They did not invite him in, but neither did they protest his arrival. He asked about the screams. They denied nothing, only shifted uneasily, muttering that all was well, that there was no trouble worth the law's concern. It was the barn that betrayed them. As the sheriff stepped toward it, the family stirred, blocking his path, speaking in broken phrases about chores and cattle. He pushed past, the smell of hay and damp earth filling his lungs as he slid the door aside. Inside, in the dimness, he found the source of the cries. A boy, no more than 12, sat chained by the ankle to a beam, his clothes soiled, his hair hanging in matted clumps across his face. He rocked back and forth, muttering a string of words that carried no sense, repeating them as though compelled by something within. His lips cracked from the effort, his voice frayed to a whisper that never ceased. The sheriff described the sight in his report with terse phrases: child restrained, mental unsoundness suspected. Family states, touched by the blood. That last line he copied exactly as it was spoken, the words offered by the eldest present, who explained no further. To them, the boy's condition required no explanation beyond blood itself. It was inheritance, not cruelty, that had placed him there. They claimed the chain was for his safety, lest he wander into the fields or fling himself into the river. The sheriff did not linger. He unfastened the chain long enough to confirm the boy's restraint was not recent injury, then left him where he Saturday. His authority extended only so far, and the hollow's silence pressed against him until he could no longer bear it. He rode back to town and filed his report, careful, incomplete, already aware that nothing more would come of it. The boy remained in the barn, his muttering rising into the night. Another voice swallowed by the hollow, explained away with the same phrase the family had always used, touched by the blood. As the century turned, stories began to circulate of a figure glimpsed at the edges of fields where the hollow pressed against neighboring farms. She was first described by a pair of children walking home from a creek at dusk. They swore they saw a woman standing among the rows of corn, her gown pale against the darkening sky. She did not move until the children called out, thinking her lost. Then she bolted, cutting through the stalks with a speed that left them frozen in fear. When their parents searched the fields later, they found no one, only the lingering sense that eyes had watched from somewhere unseen. More sightings followed. Farmers mending fences at twilight caught sight of her drifting across the ridge, her figure half hidden in mist. Her gown, once white, hung in tatters, streaked with dirt and torn at the hem. She appeared barefoot, her hair unbound, her movements jerking from stillness into sudden flight. Always she was silent until approached, when she would utter strange, breathless sounds, not words but fragments, before vanishing into the woods. One man tried to follow her and came back shaken, saying she moved faster than he thought possible, her body low to the ground like an animal escaping a snare. Whispers spread that she was one of the Hollow family, a daughter who had slipped from their watch. Some claimed she had been married off to kin while still a child, her mind breaking under the weight of it. Others believed she had been confined for years in the farmhouse and had only recently begun to wander. A neighbor's wife told of leaving a basket of food at the edge of her property after seeing the woman's pale figure, only to find it gone the next morning, the bread and apples taken, the basket left neatly in place. The stories unsettled the county more than any scream or rumor of madness, for the woman's presence suggested something uncontained. The hollow had always seemed to keep its strangeness within, but now it spilled outward into familiar fields. At night, mothers warned children not to linger outdoors, and men walking home from taverns felt their steps quicken when the wind rustled through the grass. They imagined the pale figure waiting just beyond sight, her torn gown trailing, her voice broken into sounds that no longer belonged to speech. She was never caught, never named, never claimed by her kin. The family denied her when questioned, their eyes flat, their words muttered. But the sightings continued, enough to etch her into local memory as more than rumor. The woman in white became an omen, a restless presence at the edge of vision, neither ghost nor neighbor but something in between, fleeing each time she was seen, as though even she could not bear to be recognized. The hollow had long kept its own, shielding strangeness behind shuttered windows and the silence of kinship. But by the end of the 19th century, the burden grew too heavy even for them to contain. It was whispered that two brothers, young men in years but childlike in their bearing, had begun to unsettle even their family. They wandered at night, shrieking into the dark, chasing livestock until the animals scattered in terror. Their speech was a jumble of guttural sounds, half snarls and broken syllables that no one outside the hollow could decipher. Neighbors spoke of seeing them crouched in ditches, bare-chested despite the cold, eyes gleaming as though lit from within. In 1899, the county finally intervened. The sheriff, accompanied by two deputies, rode into the hollow to carry the brothers away. The family did not resist, though neither did they offer help. They stood aside, muttering that the boys were touched by the blood and beyond correction. The brothers fought wildly, clawing and spitting, their bodies twisting with a strength that startled even seasoned officers. Ropes were needed to bind them to the wagon, their howls echoing through the valley long after the wheels turned toward town. At the state asylum, the intake clerk recorded their arrival with a detachment that belied the strangeness of what he witnessed. His notes remain, a handful of lines that condense 2 human lives into a catalogue of deformity. Bestial in manner, he wrote. Speech incomprehensible, composed of animal noises and shrieks. Heads ill-formed, foreheads low, jaws protruding. The description reads less like observation and more like classification, as though he were documenting specimens rather than men. He added that they resisted clothing, tore at bedding, and consumed meals with their hands, smearing food across their mouths without thought for order. Other attendants expanded the record in daily logs. They described the brothers as inseparable, pacing side by side in the yard, grunting to one another in a private tongue that no one else understood. When separated, even briefly, they grew violent, throwing themselves against walls or sinking teeth into their own flesh until they bled. Their presence unsettled the other inmates, who gave them wide berth as though instinctively afraid. For the family left behind in the hollow, their removal was both a relief and a wound. 2 more had been lost to the outside world, claimed by institutions that promised control where kinship had failed. But in truth, the asylum offered no cure. The brothers were confined, catalogued, and forgotten, their lives reduced to lines in a ledger. For the county, the matter was closed. For the hollow, it was another sign that madness had become not misfortune but destiny, and the asylum doors closed not only on the brothers, but on any hope that the bloodline could escape itself. The hollow did not change because the county wished it to, nor because institutions carried away those who could no longer be managed at home. When 2 brothers were locked behind asylum walls, the family mourned little, for they had always expected such fates. What unsettled outsiders most was not the removal of the broken, but the persistence of birth. Each year seemed to bring another handful of children into the cabins, their faces echoing the same narrow lines, their eyes carrying that familiar vacancy. It was as though the blood itself, however corrupted, insisted upon replenishing its ranks. Neighbors who ventured close enough to glimpse them in fields or at the schoolhouse saw patterns repeat with cruel precision. Infants failed to thrive, some never surviving beyond their first winter. Those who did live often grew slowly, their limbs thin, their speech stunted, their tempers unpredictable. Laughter erupted at odd moments, followed by silence that pressed too heavily for a child's face. Yet in the hollow, none of this drew alarm. To them, it was ordinary, the way life unfolded when bound by kin alone. Madness had ceased to be a deviation. It had become the rule, the thread woven through every branch of their knot of a family tree. County officials urged change, though their efforts stopped short of force. Ministers spoke of opening the gates, of finding unions beyond the ridges, yet their sermons fell upon blank stares. Suitors from neighboring farms did not seek daughters of the hollow, and the family themselves showed no interest in looking outward. They had become self-sufficient, not only in food and labor, but in blood. Cousins married cousins, and when questioned, they gave only muttered phrases, insisting this was how it had always been, how it must continue. By the final decades of the 19th century, the hollow was spoken of less as a place and more as a condition. In taverns, men joked that to marry into that family was to wed not a wife, but a curse. Women in nearby towns whispered warnings to their children, forbidding them from wandering too close to the ridge. Yet despite the fear, despite the institutions that claimed a few of their number, the family endured, replenished by each birth. Madness no longer startled them. It was folded into expectation, a future written before a child drew its first breath. Some grew to labor in the fields, appearing almost ordinary to the untrained eye. Others wandered the roads at night, muttering to themselves, or sat rocking on porches, lost to a world no one else could see. Together they formed the rhythm of the hollow, a cycle of birth, affliction, and silence that no outsider could break. The line held firm, closed in on itself, a circle without end. By 1920, the hollow had taken on a life beyond its ridges. It was no longer just a hidden valley where a family lived apart, but a story told in kitchens, taverns, and schoolyards. Locals began to call it the Hollow of Echoes, a name that carried with it both distance and dread. The phrase did not appear in county records or maps, but it slipped easily from one tongue to another, a shorthand for strangeness that needed little explanation. Everyone knew what it meant, a place where silence was not empty, but inhabited, where voices clung to the air long after the speaker had gone. Children were the boldest in testing the legend. Groups of boys dared one another to creep toward the homestead at dusk, to cross the line where the fields thinned into overgrown paths. They returned, swearing that they heard sounds carried on the wind, thin laughter that rose suddenly and cut off like a door slamming. Some claimed they saw a pale face in an upstairs window, watching with an intensity that froze them mid-step. Others insisted they heard muttering in the brush, though when they turned, nothing stirred but the grass. These stories multiplied with each telling, the details shifting, but the essence always the same. The hollow was alive with echoes. Adults pretended to dismiss the tales, but even they avoided the valley after dark. Farmers working nearby fields swore that sound carried differently there. A shout would return to the ear in a warped tone, as if altered by unseen mouths. At night, dogs bristled and refused to approach the ridge. One old woman told of hanging laundry near the boundary and hearing her own name whispered from the trees, though no one stood there. She packed her basket and fled without turning back. The family themselves remained, unchanged in their routines. Smoke curled from chimneys, crops grew in their careful rows, but their presence was marked more by absence than by life. They seldom came into town, and when they did, they spoke little, eyes lowered, movements stiff. To outsiders, this only confirmed the sense that the hollow was less a home than a haunted place, its inhabitants part of the landscape as much as the ridges and trees. By then, the madness of the bloodline had seeped into memory as folklore. No longer just a private tragedy, it became a public caution, a tale parents used to frighten children into obedience. The Hollow of Echoes was a name born of fear, but it carried truth in it too. For those who lived near, the laughter on the wind was not only imagination. It was the sound of a family that had folded in on itself until even silence bore their mark. By the middle of the 20th century, the hollow had nearly slipped from public thought, remembered only in fragments of local lore and the whispers of those who lived closest to its boundary. But in 1947, a young journalist from the county paper, restless for a story that might set him apart, decided to seek it out. What he found was not myth, nor memory, but living proof of a family sealed within its own blood for generations. He came expecting poverty and isolation. What he carried back was something darker. The journalist's notes describe a cluster of siblings living in cabins without electricity. The walls blackened from years of wood smoke, the floors bare but for straw and broken chairs. Their bodies bore the unmistakable weight of time's closed circle, limbs bent at odd angles, spines twisted, faces stamped with the same repeating features. They spoke, but their words came in guttural bursts, half snarls strung with syllables that no outsider could parse. He recorded that their eyes moved constantly, darting from shadow to light, from his face to the corners of the room, never resting. Their movements were jerky, as though every step required effort. Every gesture was born not of thought but reflex. What struck him most was the silence that fell whenever he tried to speak. He asked their names, their ages, whether they had ever left the hollow. At first they only stared, then muttered to one another in sounds that carried no meaning to him. Once, one of the sisters broke into sudden laughter, a high, thin cry that ended abruptly when another struck her across the arm. After that, no one made a sound for several minutes. He described the air as dense with absence, as though the very walls absorbed whatever words might have filled the room. The photographs he took that day reveal more than his words. Grainy black and white images show the siblings gathered on a porch, their clothes patched but filthy, their eyes unfocused, their mouths hanging half open as though caught mid-breath. In one frame, a boy crouches low to the ground, his hands pressed flat like an animal ready to spring. In another, two sisters lean together, their faces nearly identical, their stares locked on the camera with a mix of vacancy and suspicion. The journalist never published the story. His editor deemed it unfit, too sensational, too cruel. Instead, the photographs and notes were quietly placed in a county archive, sealed under the pretense of privacy. For decades, they gathered dust in drawers no one opened, the evidence of a family's decline preserved but hidden. Locals still spoke of the hollow, but now with a hush sharpened by knowledge. The last generation had been seen, captured in images that proved what rumor had always suggested. They lived without light, without language as others knew it, bound together by a bloodline that had turned in upon itself until there was nowhere left to go. The story of the hollow does not end with the faded photographs or the sealed reports. Traces remain, scattered like ash across records that few bother to read. In census rolls, a handful of names appear into the mid-20th century, always grouped together, never branching outward into neighboring households. By the 1960s, the entries dwindle until only initials are listed, stripped of detail, forgotten by the clerks who copied them without care. In asylum ledgers, too, fragments survive. Men and women admitted with notes of congenital defect or unsound mind, their surnames familiar to anyone who knows the hollow's history. The handwriting changes over decades, but the pattern remains. The bloodline did not vanish suddenly. It thinned, its remnants dispersed into institutions and bureaucratic margins until only the paper carried their existence. To speak of them today is to step into silence. The farmhouses have collapsed into piles of timber, swallowed by vines, their stones carried off for boundary walls on other men's land. The fields once renowned for their abundance lie overgrown, choked with bramble and wild grass. Nothing remains to suggest order or care, only ruins slowly dissolving into the earth. Yet even as the structures crumble, the memory of the family endures, not through names or faces, but through the unsettling idea they embodied. Madness there was not chance. It was inheritance, sealed into the very marrow of the people who refused to look beyond themselves. Locals still speak of the hollow in low tones. Hunters claim they feel watched when they pass its edge, though no cabins stand there now. Children repeat the old dare to wander close at dusk, swearing they hear laughter that does not belong to the present. Whether such sounds are real or imagined hardly matters. What clings to the valley is not the people themselves, but the weight of what they became, a caution wrapped in silence, a truth too uncomfortable to speak openly. The inescapable truth is that the family built its own prison. By closing the gates, by wedding kin to kin, they sealed themselves in a cycle that allowed no release. Every child born carried not only the name of the past but its burden, until the distinction between memory and inheritance vanished. Madness was no affliction to be treated. It was the bloodline itself, repeating across generations, until there was nothing left but decline. In the end, no hand needed to strike them down. No law was required to erase them. They became their own undoing, a house folded inward until it consumed itself. What remains is not their voices or their deeds, but silence and absence that lingers in records, in rumor, and in the valley that once held them.